Thank you very much, Roxanne, and I must say I'm absolutely delighted to be here, cold and all, sorry, and look forward to sharing my thoughts on women in management with everyone here. Think manager, think male, as Roxanne said, but today we're going to talk about from gender bias to gender balance. Globally, women clearly have yet to achieve full equality in management. Today, women hold only 24% of senior management positions worldwide. Looking first at women at the top, let's look at women on boards of directors, and we find globally, across the European Union, 26.2% of seats are held by women. Here in the United Kingdom, you have been moving up over especially the last couple years, as I'm sure you know, up to 28.9%. In the United States, we're sort of plodding along, not going very quickly at 24%. South Africa, 17.4%. Australia also been making great strides very recently, 28.5%, and China at 9.2%. Now, as mentioned, let's sort of go back. That's where we are today. Let's go back in time. Over 45 years ago, yes, in 1973, I started to look at gender stereotyping of the managerial position as a psychological barrier to the advancement of women in management. And to give you an idea, back in 1973, there were not only very few women in management, but everyone thought that's the way it was. Nobody cared. It's unlike today. I mean, there we were. No one said, "Where are the women?" except you know who. And I didn't really understand. And so I was a young manager, no other women, and just very casually, not from a research basis, started talking to the senior VPs, and I said, how come there's no women managers? And certainly nobody ahead of me or anything. And without blinking, they said one of two things. Either women simply aren't qualified, and the other, women don't want these jobs. And I thought, I don't think so. I think there's more to this picture. So, fortunately, I was a researcher. I could ask a good research question, and quite honestly, I sort of set out to prove them wrong in terms of that was it. There were psychological barriers. So I'm going to talk about or discuss three questions this afternoon, and this is the first one from 1973-1975. And the question that I set out to answer from a research perspective was, are successful middle managers perceived to possess characteristics, attitudes, and temperaments more commonly ascribed to men in general than to women in general? And most of you are probably familiar, perhaps many of you, with the questionnaire, how I sought to answer this question. But in brief, I had three questionnaires, all very similar. The first questionnaire said, assume you're about to meet a person for the first time, and the only thing you know is that they are an adult female. Describe. And then they had a list of 92 items, and they had to describe. Second questionnaire, assume you're about to meet a person for the first time. The only thing you know is they are an adult male. Describe. And then the third questionnaire, no gender mentioned. You're about to meet the person. They are a successful middle manager. Describe. And each person only got one form of the questionnaire. What did I discover? In 1973, 1975, I had a sample across the United States, 12 companies. It was probably the first field study of its kind. I had 300 male middle managers, 167 female middle managers. The outcome was a strong relationship between gender stereotypes and requisite management characteristics. Now, visually, given what I just described, the questionnaire, what did that look like? 92 items they had to describe. Here, imagine a profile. Here's a profile of the successful middle manager. Just sort of high and low, doesn't matter what it said. The key, or why the hypothesis was shown to be true, here's the profile of the successful middle manager. Here's the profile of men in general, very, very similar. And here's the profile of the successful middle manager. Here's the profile of a woman in general. Way over here, no relationship or minimal relationship between being a successful manager and what women were perceived to be like in terms of characteristics, attitudes, and temperaments. So the implications then and now of this stereotyping, all else being equal, men are simply viewed as more qualified to be managers, leaders, than are women. Two people apply for a job, exactly the same background. The man is going to be seen as more qualified than the woman. Therefore, as I said then, and can still say now, think manager, think male, negatively affects women's opportunities for success in management. Now, sorry. That was then. We have been in the United States, myself and others, been able since 1973 to replicate this study, always with exactly the same procedures. And what has been found? For men, or for males, over time, these studies, males continue to view men as more likely than women to possess characteristics, attitudes, and temperaments necessary for managerial success. On the other hand, in terms of changes over time, for females, that has changed. Females view men and women as equally likely to possess the characteristics necessary for managerial success. Now, for our purposes today, I think you're more interested, as am I, in a global look at this phenomenon. These are not all of the studies, but these are many of the studies that have been done replicating my original research. And here in the United States, United Kingdom, one with Marilyn Davidson that I did. In all of these, the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, China, Japan, New Zealand, Turkey, Sweden, South Africa, Egypt, Ireland. In all of these, think manager, think male. And quite frankly, it sort of astonishes me that it is a global phenomenon. Gender stereotyping of the managerial position is a psychological barrier to women's advancement in management globally. Research shows there is a strong and persistent attitude held by males both across time and across cultures, and that is the part that really astonishes me. It's not that I was dealing with just a few countries that were similar. The differences among these countries in terms of political, historical, cultural are huge, and yet the outcome is the same in all of these different countries. Lastly on this, just now I'm back to sort of methodological differences, Koning did a meta-analysis. And in the study, what they did is they used 40 of my studies, the ones I just discussed, but then they also included two other groups of researchers who asked the same question but used a different methodology, Powell and Butterfield and Shinar. Didn't matter how the question was asked, what methodology, the outcome was the same. They found leadership is viewed as masculine, and once, as I found, especially strong for males. Men are seen as having the characteristics that successful leaders have, and women are perceived as not having the characteristics that successful leaders need. So, after 45 years, the manager-leader position continues to be viewed as masculine, especially by males. Gender stereotyping continues to be a major psychological barrier to women's advancement into positions of power and influence in organizations. And gender inequality is persistent and pervasive at senior management levels. Now, given all of that, and this is so since 1973, somewhere around, I think, 2012, decided to ask a second question. And that actually happened. I was at a conference listening to sort of many of the similar attitudes. Things have not changed that much. And I thought, and my question was, if we did have a more balanced representation of women in positions of power and influence, would it matter? And I got very intrigued with that question, and because, at least over time, there have been women moving up into positions of power and influence, there are some ways to answer that question. So that's the second question that I want to focus on this afternoon. Would it matter? And the way I sought to look at that, I looked at a lot of research in terms of what is the impact, or what do we know about, what is the impact of a balanced representation of women in positions of power on organizational outcomes, because that's what we study, and a sort of a little teaser here, what's the impact on world peace? But different variable here. First, let's do organizational outcomes. Women at the top, female board representation, and firm performance. Since, I think, around 2012, there have been a whole host of studies relating what's the impact of women on boards of directors and firm financial performance, the real bottom line. I think many of these studies were triggered, well, by Norway having quotas for boards of directors, and also by the EU suggesting maybe they wanted to have quotas for boards of directors. So that prompted a lot of people to do research on this topic to see, my goodness, what would happen if we really did have balance on the boards. Fortunately, there are a whole bunch of studies, but fortunately for you, I don't need to take you through all of them, because by 2015, Post and Bryan did a meta-analysis, so they threw all those studies into a hopper, and here's what they got. They looked at 140 studies, 36 different countries, included over 90,000 firms. And overall, they found a positive relationship. They found that female board representation was related to higher accounting returns, say bottom line, return on assets, return on equity. They used two moderators, and in the moderator, shareholder protection, meaning people on the boards of directors could be sued if they made errors, and there was a lot of transparency. To the extent there were strong shareholder protections, that relationship was even more positive. Also, female board representation was related to better market performance, like a Tobin's Q measure, but that moderator was only in countries with high gender parity as measured by women in the workforce, health of women, education, and so on. But overall, their study showed a positive relationship between women on boards and the firm's financial performance. Then I looked at another way to think of women at the top as not on boards, but the women who are actually running these companies. So what is the relationship between women on the top management team and firm financial performance? And in this case, the top management team means that are there women in the top 5 positions, the top 5 positions of an organization? And here again, another meta-analysis giving us a positive outcome. They had 146 studies across 33 different countries, and they found on both sets of measures, female representation on the top management team was related to both higher accounting returns, return on assets, and return on equity, and better market performance, such as the Tobin's Q measure. So women on board of directors, women on the top management team. Still staying with the same question, another way to examine, do women have an impact when they are in positions of power and influence, was to look at actually what happens. Women are on board of directors, are the actual boards better? And indeed, while no meta-analysis, women on boards of directors are clearly related to better governance practices by the organizations. These are not all the studies, but just a couple. Brown did a study in Canada, and when there were women on the boards, there were better accounting practices, and they also looked not only at financial performance measures, but non-financial. Interesting study in the US by Abbott, 574 US companies, financial restatement. Now, what does that mean? In the United States, they have to submit financial forms once a year. And the question is, do they do them correctly? And they can do them incorrectly for two reasons. There can simply be errors on the form, or when the auditors go over things, there could be some fraudulent ways of jiggling with the numbers there. Either way, this did not measure what the errors were, but they did find that to the extent there were women on the boards, they were less likely to reapply or resubmit their statements. As the authors of the study put it, the greater the estrogen, the greater the accuracy, which I thought was kind of good. And the meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier also looked at board performance. To the extent there were women on the boards, better monitoring of the firm performance, and more interest in strategy. So all positive outcomes. Oops, sorry, oops, there we go. Wait a second. There, okay. And another study that I like especially that looked at both board performance and firm performance, and I liked it because of the methodology. This is Schwartz and Ziv in Israel, and she studied their GBCs, which are called their government business companies, who for about 20 years they have been required to have women on their boards. So she had enough women in the sample. But what I like what she did, she looked at the minutes, content analysis of the minutes of 402 board meetings. And I thought, bless her heart, that's quite a research adventure there. But 402 meetings, examine the minutes, examine them for issues and actions on these issues. She had something like 2,400 issues that she looked at. And then she divided the sample in terms of gender balance and non-gender balance on the boards. She was able to have gender balance as 3 and 3. If a board had 3 women and 3 men, and maybe even more than that, but at least 3 and 3, they were gender balanced. If they didn't, they went in the other pile. And to the extent they were in the other pile, they were all male dominated. So it wasn't that there were some boards with more women than men. They were either gender balanced or they were male dominated. What did she find? Better performance. Gender balanced boards were more likely to request further information, and they were more likely to take initiative to take action on what they looked for. So a far more active, proactive board. She also did a second study similar to the earlier ones that I quoted, and once again, as before, she found that gender balanced boards were related to higher return on equity and better net profit margin. Once again, a positive outcome. Oops. Okay, and another way of looking at, and this I will admit to, shall we say, cherry picking, I wanted to find out about corporate social responsibility and did women on boards have any impact on that in an organization. There have not been a lot of studies. So far, the ones that I've examined, however, have all been both interesting and positive. And the two that I'm just going to mention, Cook and Glass, most recently in 2018, they looked at the Fortune 500 companies over a longitudinal study over a period of 2001 to 2010, so nice study. And they found that female representation on boards was related to having a greater impact on corporate social responsibility. What did they mean by that? Community. The companies were more likely to have their employees be volunteers on company time. Governance, the leaders of these companies were more likely to be on nonprofit boards and be involved in public policy. And in terms of environment, these companies were the ones that were more likely to be pushing for clean air, clean water, et cetera. So very positive outcomes. And then another study in China, they had just had 2 earthquakes, and the researchers then looked at what they called corporate philanthropic disaster response. And similarly, they found that to the extent there were female representation on the board of directors, there was more natural disaster giving than when there were not women on the boards. So, the question that I was seeking to answer, gender balance and organizational performance, women on boards improve firm performance, women in senior management enhance firm performance, women on boards improve corporate governance practices, and women on boards may enhance corporate social responsibility impact. Oops. Okay. Now, I promised you world peace. Here is world peace. This is the neatest set of studies. Hudson and her colleagues did research, title of their book, Sex and World Peace. Now, that'll get anybody's attention, and I'm sure their publisher knew that, but it's good research. And they found the greater the gender equality, the less likely a nation is to be involved in inter- and intrastate conflict, use force first, or resort to higher levels of violence in conflict. Now, just a couple of the studies that confirm that. First, looking at international conflicts, Caparelli found, okay, the greater the percentage of women in parliament, in the upper levels of parliament in a country, the less use of military force to settle disputes. And it's sort of an interesting dependent variable here because they go from negotiating disputes to war. Not something we usually have in our research, but they did. So from negotiating to war, the more likely that the greater the percentage of women in parliament, the less likely they went to war, the more likely they negotiated. Same thing with Caparelli and Boyer using a different data set. The greater the percentage of women in parliament, the less use of severe levels of violence in a crisis. Another set of studies, these were within state conflicts. Here the dependent variable was the number of people who were killed in these battles. Caparelli, they didn't have parliament, but they had the percentage of women in the labor force, the less internal armed conflict, the fewer people who died in battle. And then Melander, who did have the greater the percentage of women in parliament, the lower the levels of internal armed conflict. So, this research shows a nation's gender equality is related to less use of violence in international conflicts and lower internal armed conflict. Which brings me back to the second question that I was looking at, and the question was, if we had a more balanced representation of women in positions of power and influence, would it matter? Based on what I've just said, I conclude a more balanced representation of women in positions of power and influence really does matter. It matters in terms of organizational outcomes, and it may even be, possibly, a path to world peace. Now, third question, because if I'm going to say these two, you have to ask the third question, which is, from gender bias to gender balance, actions for change. What needs to be done to achieve gender balance, especially at senior levels of leadership? Now, at this point, with the third question, especially after all these years, how I would love to, whip aside the curtain and say, or here's the magic bullet, and here's the answer, but I can't. I would like to, maybe someday, but I don't think. What I've really concluded is there is no one answer. That all of you here who are interested in or working on or want to be working on a way to attack this question, we need everybody working on all fronts to address this question. What I'm going to focus on in my third question is what I think we ought to be doing. I just think it's one of the many focuses, but I do think it's sort of an untapped but key focus to achieve greater gender balance at senior management levels. And what is that? I think what we need to do is challenge the corporate convenient, what I call corporate convenient, you could call it organizational convenient if you want, the corporate convenient way of structuring managerial work and replace it with structures and cultures that facilitate gender parity. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? I think that a major barrier to women's equality is our assumption about how work is done and the norms around these activities, especially at senior levels. And I'm really referring, you might be familiar with the anytime, anywhere performance model, as McKinsey calls it. The 24/7 work culture is another way of referring to it. Women, more so than men, pay the price for operating in this culture, and therefore it perpetuates gender equality. Two examples in terms of trying to get the work balance right at the senior levels. How often do we hear senior women opting out? Oh, I'm going to work for a smaller firm. Oh, I'm going to start my own company so that I can better handle the work-family balance. She's opting out. Or we find, unfortunately, when women do take advantage of the policies that we have, sort of some of our work-family policies of part-time or flex time or something, when they take advantage of these policies, as they're allowed to do, their careers suffer. They tend to be passed over. They tend to be viewed as not team players. So even though that's company policy, it works against them. So what can we do? What I think we need to do is take a whole fresh look at what's going on and, as I said, challenge the corporate convenient way of structuring managerial work. We need to ask the question, what work demands and requirements are convenient to the corporation in the old order of a gender-based division of labor that we are all familiar with? You know, the little woman is home packing his suitcase and he's off going from business trip to business trip, and that's the way the world used to be. Everything was separate. There was no work-family issue, or they had it settled. Home was here, work was there. The old order. Well, the world has changed. Are these work demands necessary today? Are these work demands necessary to do the managerial job? Or are they only simply corporate convenient? Now, in looking at research to answer this question, one way to look at it is a nice attitudinal study. And this was a study of Fortune 500 senior male executives. And 73% said, yeah, it's possible to restructure senior management jobs to increase productivity and provide a work-life balance. 84%, these are all men, 4% of these men said, and I'd like these job options, but savvy men. 50% of them said, yeah, but I think talking about these with my boss would hurt my career, and probably right. Now, that's an attitudinal study. The study that I want to discuss that I think is an excellent study because it answers the question, which is the key question. It's not how we feel about it. It's, can work be done differently and still be done well? Getting at the performance aspect. I mean, it's the same reason when I, in question number 2, looked at, does it matter if we have women in top management? And I sought the answer by looking at the hard bottom line data of firm financial performance. That's the kind of answer that I think changes minds or attitudes. Similarly, this is the question that needs to be answered. Can work be done differently, and can it still be done well? And a wonderful study by Erin Reed in 2015, she did a study of a global strategy consulting firm in Boston, and she conducted 115 interviews and also collected performance data. What was she investigating? She interviewed these high-level, very active consultants, and she was asking them what is about their commitment to this 24/7 work demands, which was the way the company tended to operate. And she divided their answers, or the people, how they responded, into 3 different groups. Now, this was not a male-female gender study. There were some women in the study, sort of, but not a lot. Mainly males, but some women. And she found that the consultants divided into 3 different groups in terms of their answers. The first group she called embracing. Now, these were the 24/7, you need to jump, it's how high. I will do what I'm told. I don't have a work-family problem because I don't have a balance. I'm all work. I'm 70, 80 hours a week. I work, and I love it. So they just embrace the 24/7 work culture. Second group she called revealing. Now, these were the consultants, again, mainly males, who were struggling to get a work-family balance. They didn't go for this 24/7 round-the-clock work. How did they achieve their balance? They used the company policies. They asked their boss for things like part-time occasionally, for some flex time, to take a family leave when they had a personal issue, to get it resolved. So they went by the book, and these were policies in the organization. So she called them revealing. And then the third group showed up, and these were about equal in number in each of the 3 groups. Third group she called passing. And these were a little different. These were consultants who, similar to the revealing folks and unlike the embracing folks, also struggled with work family. We're not totally in touch with 24/7, but they came up with a different way of handling the situation. She called them passing because they worked under the radar. They never asked or told their bosses or asked permission. They just kept working, but they worked a little differently. They tried to get clients who were geographically close. So to maximize would they ever get home for dinner, often they did because they worked close to home. That didn't always work, of course. They also developed totally informally a team, a couple of others that they worked with, who passed the work around. So if one couldn't do it, they said, hey, can you pick up on this for me? The other did it. But they never told their senior bosses. This was not a team. This was all informal, under the radar. And the third thing they tended to do was do a lot of telecommuting, but they never mentioned where they were going or what they were doing. So a typical behavior might be a guy leaving the office looking busy at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, running out, got a meeting. Doesn't say, just looks like he's going to a meeting. He's going to his son's soccer game, gets on the phone, he's having a conference call, da-da-da-da-da, run, Johnny, run, da-da-da-da-da. Nobody knows. He doesn't say where he is. He doesn't say a peep. He just does his job, and he also watches Johnny in the soccer game under the radar. Okay, so 3, and their work, I mean, they all worked hard, but say maybe 50 to 60 hours compared to the 70, 80. So they got a work-family balance. Now, okay, but as I said, it's performance that matters. What did she find? And there you see it. The embracing, they were the superstars, no question, the superheroes, actual performance ratings, high ratings, rewarded shortly after this study. Many of them got promotions. They were all on the fast track. I mean, you name it, they got it. They earned it. They worked pretty hard. That was the feeling, the stars. And as predicted, the revealing, they asked permission. Can I take a leave? Yeah, well, not a team player. They were viewed as deviants, and they were punished. The performance ratings were significantly less than the other groups, medium ratings. They were punished. 1 or 2 left. Usually, in other cases, they were simply passed over. Their promotions were slow career track. But look at the passing. Under the radar group, no difference. They too were viewed as stars, as superheroes. The study has quotes of their bosses saying, oh yes, someday he's going to lead the company, et cetera, et cetera. So same stars, same high ratings, and in some cases even a little higher. Rewarded, same fast track, same rapid promotions. So what does this study tell us or suggest? First part, all of us sort of know this intuitively anyway. Working long hours is not necessary for high performance. This study showed it. And more importantly, you can reorganize work such that it is more predictable and consumes fewer hours without hurting performance. And the 24/7 culture may well be, as I phrased it, corporate convenient, but it may certainly not be necessary. And that is the key outcome. So, in terms of challenging corporate convenient, and where I think the next set of, or a lot more research needs to be done, this is just one study, this is where I think a lot of our research should go, how work is, the big work at the senior levels is done. I think we need to challenge the patriarchal, male-centered organizational design, and that's what we've got, that thinks manager, thinks male. And we need to, if only we could start from scratch, but we need to design organizations and work structures that are effective and envision women and men as equal participants in the workforce. I think this quote by Frena Gwynwala of South Africa says it better than I've just said it, and she says, "Institutions that discriminate are man-shaped and must be made people-shaped. Only then will women be able to function as equals within these institutions." And finally, discuss the three questions. I just want to put sort of this kind of work, if you will, up here to show you it's now on the world stage, from gender bias to gender balance, and two good examples. Some of you may be familiar with the United Nations 17 Sustainable Goals for 2030. I see some head nods here. And Sustainable Goal 5 is gender equality. And to our purposes here this afternoon, Sustainable Goal 5.5 reads as, "Ensure women's full participation and equal opportunity for leadership in all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life." Similarly, as the second example, the United Nations World Conference on Women held in Beijing came out with the Beijing Platform for Action. It had 12 critical areas. The United Nations in 2020 is going to reevaluate that action to sort of where we've been and where are we now. Of the 12 critical areas, once again, same as SDG 5.5, critical area 7 says, "Ensure women's equal access to and full participation in power structures and decision-making." So we are, in essence, with this topic, on the world stage. We now have a global endeavor to improve the status of women in positions of power and influence. And I'm going to conclude with another quote by Michelle Bachelet, who is currently the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, but she was also the first executive director of UN Women. She summarizes my talk, I believe, where she said, "Supporting faster progress for women is not only morally right," and that I want to say, that's the beginning. We start with it is the right thing to do, end of discussion. But nonetheless, it is not only morally right, it makes good political and economic sense. This holds true for countries or companies. Thank you.